Historic site for an unprecedented meeting between East and West. Responding to a special invitation, President and Mrs. Nixon arrive, and Premier Zhou Enlai is on hand to extend an official welcome to the presidential couple. It's Mr. Nixon's initial move toward his self-proclaimed goal, a generation of peace. A confident president, anxious to end the diplomatic freeze between the United States and China, meets with Chairman Mao. Top aide Henry Kissinger joins the talks with Premier Zhou Enlai on Vietnam and East-West trade. The First Lady views giant pandas, a gift of the People's Republic. Personal presidential diplomacy tentatively parts the bamboo curtain. Next stop, Moscow. Purpose, a summit meeting between President Nixon and Soviet leaders Brezhnev and Kosygin. Agreement is reached on limitations of nuclear weapons, the sale of American wheat to the Soviets, and a trade of beverages, our soft drinks for their vodka. Another victory for personal diplomacy on a global scale. Back, Munich houses the Olympic flame as athletes from all over the globe gather for the traditional games. Officials hope that world tensions will not create an incident. Optimism dies as Israeli athletes are held hostage by Arab guerrilla terrorists who invade the Israeli compound. By helicopter, the captive Israeli athletes are taken to Munich airport, where one of the fanatic guerrillas destroys the craft, killing himself and 11 Israelis. Suddenly, an election year and presidential politics heat up. There's no lack of Democratic candidates. Maine Senator Edmund Muskie is an early favorite. Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, first black woman in serious contention. Also in the race, veteran Politico Hubert Humphrey, South Dakota Senator George McGovern, dark horse choice of the youth vote, and Alabama Governor George Wallace, opponent of busing and welfare.
I did represent more of the average citizen in this country than did any other candidate.
At this rally in Silver Spring, Maryland, Governor Wallace's campaign is crushed by violence. Arthur Bremer, seen applauding, a 21-year-old busboy, uses the cover of the crowd and the confusion to get close enough to the candidate for an attempted assassination. It comes suddenly and without warning. Wallace survives, but his wounds leave him a paralyzed man. The Democratic Convention showdown comes in July in Miami. As a prelude, Senator McGovern wins 4 primaries in 24 hours and is in high spirits.
I can't believe we've won the whole thing.
The energetic Mrs. McGovern joins her husband, and the convention, bent on a reform candidate, chooses the South Dakota senator, who then voices his campaign theme.
Home, America. Come home to the affirmation that we have a dream.
Missouri's Thomas Eagleton is chosen to be McGovern's running mate. Later, Eagleton comes under political fire for a medical history which includes emotional disorders. McGovern is forced to drop Eagleton and ultimately chooses former Peace Corps head Sergeant Shriver. Nixon wins re-election in a landslide victory and immediately looks to the future.
And the next 4 years will be the time that we will try to make ourselves worthy of this victory.
The Nixon-Agnew team receives an overwhelming mandate from the American voters, sweeping every state but one, Massachusetts. With Mother Nature unleashes the fury of Hurricane Agnes across 4 states: Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and New York. 134 lives are lost, thousands are homeless, and damage runs into the millions. Apollo 16 lifts America back into space and gives our astronauts a dune buggy tour of lunar land. Then Apollo 17, first nighttime launch in history. The Apollo phase of the United States space exploration program concludes in a blaze of glory. The flight of Apollo 17, like all its predecessors, adds invaluable information to our treasury of space knowledge. What our astronauts have learned on these voyages to the moon may well serve to improve dramatically the lot of man's life on Earth. Apollo 17, the last glorious chapter in just one phase of man's attempt to conquer life's last frontier, space. To be the focal point of world attention, American negotiators arrive for another in a long series of peace talks with the North Vietnamese. Presidential aide Henry Kissinger, a key figure in the lengthy and complex conferences, sounds a premature note of hope.
We believe that peace is at hand.
The Paris peace talks stalled, the Vietnam War worsens. Responding to a devastating Viet Cong offensive, President Nixon orders new measures.
All entrances to North Vietnamese ports will be mined to prevent access to these ports and North Vietnamese naval operations from these ports.
Violence in the Philippines as President Marcos' wife is attacked by a crazed assailant with a machete. Incredibly, Mrs. Marcos survives. Her would-be assassin is killed. Chile's Marxist president, Salvador Allende, a controversial figure, is the center of a storm of protest in Santiago. Street riots over inflation force Allende to call in the army. Northern Ireland remains locked in the grip of a civil war which turns Catholic against Protestant, neighbor against neighbor. Death in the streets is a daily tragedy. In Vietnam, giant B-52 bombers punish Haiphong and other parts of North Vietnam with round-the-clock saturation bombing missions. The devastation is widespread, and this new phase of the years-long conflict brings cries of outrage from Hanoi. The Truman Library in Independence, Missouri, where the body of former Chief Executive Harry S. Truman lies in state. Death came at 88 after a long and typically courageous struggle with illness. Former President and Mrs. Johnson and President and Mrs. Nixon attend rites. Mrs. Bess Truman and daughter Margaret carry out the wishes of the former president, expressing a desire for dignity and simplicity in his final ceremonies. From haberdasher to president, decisive leader through 2 wars, a legend in his own time. World air travel is disrupted in 1972 by the threat of the skyjacker, who hijacks airliners for ransom and holds passengers and crew hostage. Airport security screens travelers, while one purrs, "I'm Kitty, fly me."